The sun hung low in the pale blue sky, its golden light stretching over the dusty road like a thin veil. A quiet stillness surrounded the lone gas station, its peeling paint and faded signs standing as a testament to time. It wasn't much, just two pumps, a vending machine that occasionally worked, and a small convenience store with a glass front that reflected the vast, empty landscape around it. Jack Mercer leaned against his old, beat-up pickup truck, sipping from a dented thermos that had seen better days. His weathered hands cradled the warm metal, the faint aroma of strong coffee wafting up with the breeze. His truck was as unassuming as he was: faded green paint, a few scratches, and a bed filled with odds and ends from a recent trip to the hardware store. To anyone passing by, Jack looked like an ordinary man. His simple plaid shirt, worn jeans, and scuffed boots painted a picture of someone who had long embraced a quieter, simpler life. His gray hair, neatly combed back, and his calm, steady eyes added to the impression. The kind of man you'd see on a postcard from the countryside: peaceful, unbothered, and maybe even a little boring. But Jack wasn't just anyone. Years ago, he had been someone else entirely. He had worn a badge on his chest and carried the weight of responsibility on his shoulders. Decades in law enforcement had shaped him into a man who could read people like a book. He had faced danger head-on, made tough decisions, and had scars both physical and emotional to prove it. But those days were behind him. Or so he thought. Jack had moved to this quiet stretch of nowhere to escape the chaos that came with the badge. The city, with its blaring sirens, unending stress, and relentless crime, had drained him. He wanted peace, a chance to wake up to the sound of birds instead of shouting. And for the most part, he had found it. This tiny town, with its kind but distant neighbors and long stretches of silence, had become his sanctuary. Yet, peace is a fragile thing. Jack's attention drifted to the horizon as a faint sound broke the stillness. At first, it was just a hum, low and distant, barely noticeable over the rustling of the wind. But it grew louder, more distinct. The rumble of engines. Not one, but many. It was the unmistakable roar of motorcycles cutting through the air like a pack of wolves. He set his thermos down on the truck bed, his movements deliberate, his eyes narrowing slightly as he watched the horizon. The first bike appeared, a dark silhouette against the golden glow of the morning sun. Then another. And another. 5 in total. They moved in formation, the riders clad in leather jackets and helmets that gleamed in the sunlight. The bikes snarled as they pulled into the gas station, breaking the stillness with their aggressive growls. Dust swirled around their tires, and the faint scent of gasoline mixed with the crisp morning air. Jack didn't move. He simply observed, his face calm but his mind alert. Years of experience had taught him to pay attention to details: the way the riders carried themselves, the tattoos snaking down their arms, the heavy boots they wore. These weren't just weekend bikers out for a joyride. They had a presence about them, one that hinted at trouble. The leader of the group, a towering man with broad shoulders and a snake tattoo curling up his neck, swung off his bike first. He removed his helmet, revealing a sharp, chiseled face framed by a scruffy beard. His eyes scanned the gas station lazily, landing briefly on Jack before moving on. The other bikers followed suit, each one dismounting with a mix of swagger and confidence. They laughed loudly, their voices cutting through the stillness as they slapped each other on the back and made their way toward the gas pumps. One of them, a wiry man with a jagged scar across his cheek, kicked at a soda can lying on the ground, sending it skittering across the pavement. Jack remained where he was, leaning against his truck. His thermos sat forgotten beside him. He didn't react, didn't flinch, didn't even blink as the group spread out around the station like a pack marking its territory. To them, he was invisible, a background character in their story. But Jack knew better. He had seen men like this before. They walked into places like they owned them, their confidence teetering on the edge of arrogance. They thrived on intimidation, feeding off the fear they caused in others. But there was something else Jack had learned in his years of service. Men like this only pushed as far as they thought they could. The leader strode toward the pumps, pulling a gas nozzle free with a casual ease. He glanced back at his crew, smirking as he held it up. "This place looks like it's been stuck in the 70s, he said, his voice loud enough to carry. "Hope the gas doesn't come with cobwebs." The others laughed, their voices echoing in the empty lot. Jack's gaze flicked toward the gas station's small convenience store. Through the glass, he could see the young attendant standing behind the counter, frozen like a deer in headlights. A boy, really couldn't have been more than 19. His wide eyes darted between the bikers and the phone on the counter, his hand hovering indecisively. Jack sighed softly, his shoulders relaxing just a fraction. He had hoped for a quiet morning. But it seemed fate had other plans. He reached for his thermos, lifting it to his lips and taking one last sip. The coffee had gone lukewarm, but he didn't mind. He set the thermos back down, his movements deliberate, and straightened up. The leader of the bikers turned his attention toward Jack then, his smirk deepening as he sized him up. "Hey, old-timer," he called out, his tone dripping with mockery. "You look like you've seen a few miles. How about making yourself useful and wiping down my bike while you're at it?" The group erupted in laughter, the sound grating and sharp. Jack didn't respond. He didn't need to. His silence spoke louder than any words could. Instead, he simply stood there, calm and unbothered, his steady gaze locked on the leader. It was a look that said everything and nothing at the same time, a look that had once stopped men twice his size in their tracks. The leader's smirk faltered, just for a moment. Jack noticed. But he didn't move. Didn't speak. He just waited, knowing that patience was often the strongest weapon in situations like these. And as the sun climbed higher in the sky, casting long shadows across the gas station lot, the stage was quietly set for what would come next. The leader recovered quickly, his bravado snapping back into place like a mask. He turned to his crew, spreading his arms in mock disbelief. "You see this guy? Just standing there like he's carved out of stone. Hey, Pops, you forget how to talk, or are you just slow?" Another round of laughter erupted from the group. One of the younger bikers, a lanky man with wild, unkempt hair and a chipped tooth, slapped his knee as if the comment were the funniest thing he'd ever heard. Still, Jack remained silent. He wasn't ignoring them, not exactly. He was watching, waiting, assessing. His years of experience had taught him that people reveal more about themselves when they think no one is challenging them. The wiry man with the scar strolled toward the vending machine, giving it a once-over before kicking the base. It rattled but didn't budge. "Broken junk," he muttered before turning to the others. "Guess this place doesn't get much action." "That's about to change," the leader said, his tone dripping with a mix of amusement and malice. He turned his attention back to Jack, his smirk widening. "So, what's your story, old man? You live around here, or you just passing through?" Jack finally moved, tilting his head slightly as if considering the question. His voice, when it came, was calm and steady. "Just grabbing some gas and coffee." "Same as you." The leader's smirk faltered again, ever so slightly. Something about Jack's tone didn't sit right with him. It wasn't nervous or intimidated, it was neutral, controlled, as if Jack were the one deciding how this conversation would go. "Oh, yeah," the leader said, taking a step closer. "You don't sound like a local. You got a funny way of talking. Where you from?" Jack didn't answer immediately. Instead, he picked up his thermos and took another sip of coffee, his eyes never leaving the leader's. When he finally spoke, his words were deliberate. "Doesn't much matter where I'm from. What matters is I'm here now." "Same as you." The leader chuckled, though the sound was forced. He didn't like the way Jack carried himself, too calm, too collected. Most people either cowered or postured in the face of his crew's antics. But this guy? He wasn't doing either. One of the other bikers, a burly man with arms as thick as tree trunks, stepped forward. "Boss," he said, addressing the leader, "why are we even wasting time with this guy? He's not worth it." The leader waved him off, keeping his eyes locked on Jack. "Nah, this is fun. I like seeing how long it takes for people to crack. Everyone's got a breaking point." Jack's lips curved into the faintest hint of a smile. It wasn't friendly, it was the kind of smile that didn't reach his eyes, the kind that said he'd seen this game before. "You're right," Jack said quietly. "Everyone does have a breaking point. Best not to test it." The leader's smirk disappeared altogether, replaced by a flicker of annoyance. He wasn't used to being challenged, even subtly. He stepped closer, invading Jack's personal space. "What's that supposed to mean?" the leader asked, his voice low and edged with menace. Jack didn't flinch. He didn't move. If anything, he seemed more relaxed than before. "It means you're better off sticking to your gas and moving along." The younger biker with the chipped tooth let out a bark of laughter. "You hear that? Old man thinks he's in charge." The others joined in, their laughter filling the air like a taunt. But the leader wasn't laughing anymore. He stared at Jack, his jaw tightening. "You think you're tough, don't you?" he said, his tone sharper now. Jack met his gaze, unblinking. "I don't think anything. Just telling you how it is." The leader's hand twitched toward the pocket of his leather jacket, and for a split second, the atmosphere shifted. The air grew heavier, tension crackling like electricity. But before the leader could make his move, the sound of a door creaking open drew everyone's attention. The gas station attendant had stepped outside, his hands trembling as he held a pack of cigarettes he was clearly too young to legally buy. He didn't say anything, but his wide eyes darted between Jack and the bikers, his fear palpable. The leader turned toward the boy, his expression softening into a mockery of kindness. "Hey there, kid," he said, his tone syrupy and fake. "Why don't you run back inside and mind your own business? Grown UPS are talking." The boy hesitated, his gaze flickering to Jack as if looking for guidance. Jack gave a small nod, barely perceptible, but it was enough. The boy swallowed hard and retreated back inside, the door closing with a soft thud behind him. The leader turned back to Jack, his annoyance now fully replaced by anger. "You're really starting to get on my nerves, old man." Jack's expression didn't change. He simply crossed his arms over his chest and leaned back against the truck, as if settling in for a long conversation. "That's not my intention," he said calmly. "But if that's how you feel, maybe you should ask yourself why." The leader's face flushed red, and for a moment, it seemed like he might lose control entirely. But then he took a step back, exhaling sharply as he forced a grin. "All right," he said, his tone suddenly lighter, though no less menacing. "I see how it is. You've got a little fight in you. I can respect that." He turned to his crew, spreading his arms. "What do you say, boys? Should we let the old man go on his way, or should we show him why it's not smart to mouth off to us?" The bikers exchanged glances, their laughter subsiding as they waited for the leader's cue. The air grew still again, the only sound the faint hum of the gas pumps and the distant rustle of the wind. Jack didn't move. He didn't speak. But his eyes, those calm, steady eyes, never left the leader's. And in that moment, it became clear to anyone paying attention, Jack Mercer wasn't the one who should be worried. The bikers pulled into the gas station lot, their roaring engines piercing the quiet morning air like a pack of wolves announcing their arrival. Dust kicked up around their wheels, swirling in chaotic spirals before settling over the cracked pavement. The leader, unmistakable in his presence, swung off his bike first. He stood tall and broad, his leather jacket open just enough to show off the snake tattoo that coiled up his neck. He pulled off his sunglasses and looked around, his eyes landing on Jack with a smirk that reeked of arrogance. "Well, well, well," he drawled, his voice loud enough to carry across the lot. "What do we have here? Grandpa's out for a morning stroll. You lost, old-timer." Jack didn't flinch. He remained leaning against his truck, his thermos now resting on the edge of the truck bed. His calm demeanor was almost unnatural, like the stillness before a storm. The leader wasn't used to being ignored, and it showed. His smirk deepened, but there was an edge to it now, a hint of frustration creeping in. "Hey, I'm talking to you," he said, taking a step closer. "Or are you too old to hear me?" Behind him, the other bikers dismounted, their movements casual yet deliberate. They spread out around the lot, their boots crunching on the gravel as they laughed and joked among themselves. One of them, a wiry man with long, greasy hair and a permanent sneer, walked over to the gas pump. He yanked the nozzle free and began filling his tank, letting a stream of gasoline spill onto the ground. "Oops," the man said with a chuckle, waving the nozzle as if it were a toy. "Guess I'm a little clumsy today." The others laughed, their voices echoing off the worn-out walls of the gas station. Inside the convenience store, the young attendant stood frozen behind the counter. His wide eyes darted between the bikers and Jack, his hand hovering nervously over the phone. He was clearly torn: call for help or stay silent and hope the bikers didn't notice him. Jack glanced briefly at the boy through the glass, giving him a subtle shake of the head. It wasn't much, just a quick, almost imperceptible motion, but it was enough. The boy lowered his hand, though his expression remained anxious. The leader, noticing Jack's lack of reaction, stepped closer, his boots stopping just a few feet away. He crossed his arms, looking Jack up and down like a predator sizing up its prey. "You're awfully quiet for someone standing in my way," he said, his tone dripping with mockery. "What's the matter? Cat got your tongue?" Jack straightened up slowly, his movements unhurried. He met the leader's gaze, his own eyes calm and steady. "Just enjoying my morning," he said simply. The leader barked out a laugh, throwing his head back like it was the funniest thing he'd ever heard. "Your morning, huh? Looks like we're about to make it a little more exciting for you." The wiry man at the pump tossed the nozzle back into place with a loud clang and joined the group, his smirk as sharp as the scar running down his cheek. "Gramps doesn't seem to know who he's dealing with," he said, cracking his knuckles. Another biker, a stocky man with a thick beard and an attitude to match, pulled out a cigarette and lit it with a flick of his lighter. He blew out a cloud of smoke, his eyes narrowing as he studied Jack. "Maybe we ought to teach him some manners," he said. Jack didn't react. He'd seen this kind of posturing before too many times to count. He knew what they were doing, testing him, trying to provoke a reaction. But he also knew that the moment he gave them one, they'd see it as an invitation to escalate. "Look," Jack said, his voice calm but firm. "You've got your gas. Why don't you just move along and leave the rest of us in peace?" The leader's smirk vanished, replaced by a flicker of annoyance. "Leave," he repeated, his tone hardening. "You think you can tell us what to do?" Jack shrugged, keeping his expression neutral. "Not telling you what to do. Just giving you some advice." The tension in the air grew thicker, like a coiled spring ready to snap. The leader took another step forward, now standing directly in Jack's personal space. He tilted his head, studying Jack with a mix of curiosity and contempt. "You've got a funny way of talking, old man," he said. "Kinda like you're used to people listening to you. That right?" Jack's lips twitched in the faintest hint of a smile. "Something like that." The leader didn't like that answer. His hand shot out, grabbing Jack's thermos and holding it up as if inspecting it. "What's in here?" he asked, his tone mocking. "Coffee? Tea. Something stronger. Jack didn't move. Just coffee, he said. The leader unscrewed the lid, sniffing the contents before pouring it out onto the ground. The dark liquid splattered across the pavement, mixing with the gasoline in an oily mess. Looks like you're fresh out, the leader said, tossing the empty thermos onto the truck bed with a loud clang. The other bikers laughed, their amusement filling the lot. Inside the convenience store, the young attendant flinched, his face pale. He ducked down behind the counter, trying to make himself as small as possible. Jack remained calm, his expression unreadable. He glanced briefly at the spilled coffee before looking back at the leader. "You done?" he asked, his tone still even. The leader's jaw tightened, the calmness in Jack's voice grating on his nerves. He wasn't used to people like Jack, people who didn't cower or react the way he wanted them to. It threw him off balance, and he didn't like it. "Not by a long shot," the leader said, stepping even closer. "You think you're tough, standing there all quiet and cool? Let me tell you something, old man. Out here, we run the show. Not you. Not anyone else." Jack met his gaze, unblinking. "If you say so." The leader's fist clenched, his frustration bubbling to the surface. He was on the verge of losing his temper, and Jack could see it. But that was the thing about people like him, they thrived on control. And when they felt it slipping away, they got reckless. One of the other bikers, the stocky man with the cigarette, stepped forward, sensing the shift in the atmosphere. "Boss," he said, his tone low, "maybe we should just fill up and go. No point wasting time on this guy." But the leader didn't back down. If anything, the suggestion only made him angrier. "No," he snapped. "He needs to learn his place." The group fell silent, the tension now so thick it was almost suffocating. The leader raised his hand, pointing a finger at Jack like a challenge. "You've got two options, old man," he said. "Either you apologize for disrespecting us, or we'll make sure you regret it." Jack sighed softly, his shoulders relaxing as if he were letting go of a heavy burden. He straightened up fully, stepping away from the truck and closing the small distance between them. "I don't think I'm the one who's going to have regrets," Jack said, his voice low and steady. For a brief moment, the leader hesitated, caught off guard by the quiet confidence in Jack's words. The other bikers exchanged uncertain glances, their bravado wavering. And in that moment, the balance of power began to shift. The leader's smirk faltered for a split second, a shadow of doubt crossing his face. It wasn't the words Jack spoke, it was the way he said them. Calm. Measured. Like a man who knew exactly what he was doing. "You've got guts, I'll give you that," the leader said, his voice low and edged with menace. He turned to his crew, gesturing with a broad sweep of his arm. "But guts don't mean much when you're outnumbered, do they?" The bikers grinned, their confidence returning as they closed ranks around Jack. They formed a loose circle, their movements casual but deliberate. Each man positioned himself like a predator preparing to strike, their laughter fading into silence. Jack let out a slow breath, his gaze sweeping over the group. He wasn't looking at their faces, he was watching their hands, their feet, the way their bodies shifted. These were men who relied on intimidation, who expected fear to do the heavy lifting for them. Jack had faced men like this before. And he wasn't afraid. Inside the gas station, the young attendant peeked over the counter, his trembling fingers clutching the edge. He watched with wide eyes as the scene unfolded, his breath coming in shallow gasps. The leader took another step closer, now only inches away from Jack. "Last chance, old man," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Apologize, and maybe we let you walk out of here." Jack tilted his head slightly, his expression unreadable. "Apologize for what?" The leader's jaw tightened, his patience wearing thin. "For disrespecting us," he snapped. Jack raised an eyebrow, his tone calm and almost curious. Funny. I don't remember disrespecting anyone. Just standing here, minding my own business. The leader's face flushed with anger, his composure slipping. He jabbed a finger at Jack's chest, his voice rising. You think you're clever, don't you? Think you can talk your way out of this? Jack didn't move, didn't flinch. He let the words hang in the air for a moment before replying. No. I just think you're wasting your time. The leader's hand shot out, grabbing a fistful of Jack's shirt. The other bikers tensed, ready to jump in at the slightest cue. The air crackled with unspoken aggression, the quiet broken only by the faint hum of the gas pumps. But Jack's reaction or lack of one stopped the leader in his tracks. There was no panic in Jack's eyes, no sign of fear. Instead, there was something else, something unsettling. Calm. Absolute, unshakable calm. It was enough to make the leader hesitate, his grip loosening slightly. What's your deal, huh? He demanded, his voice wavering. You think you're better than us? Jack's voice remained steady. No. I just think you don't know what you're getting into. The leader sneered, trying to shake off the unease creeping into his chest. He released Jack's shirt with a shove, stepping back as if to reassert his dominance. All right, he said, addressing his crew. Looks like the old man needs a lesson. Let's show him what happens when you mess with us. The bikers closed in, their movements slow and deliberate. The wiry man with the scar cracked his knuckles, a grin spreading across his face. The stocky man with the cigarette tossed it to the ground, crushing it under his boot as he stepped forward. Jack stood his ground, his posture relaxed but his eyes sharp. He took a step back, not out of fear but to give himself space to move. I don't want any trouble, Jack said, his voice calm but firm. But if you push me, you're not going to like where this goes. The leader laughed, though the sound was forced. Big talk for a guy with no backup. What are you gonna do, call the cops? Jack's lips twitched into a faint smile. I don't need to call anyone. The leader's grin faltered again, but he quickly masked it with bravado. We'll see about that. He raised his hand, signaling his crew to move in. The wiry man lunged first, his movements fast but sloppy. Jack sidestepped easily, his hands coming up in a fluid motion. He grabbed the man's wrist, twisting it just enough to send him sprawling to the ground with a yelp of pain. The others hesitated for a split second, caught off guard by the sudden shift. But the leader barked out an order, and they surged forward. The stocky man swung a fist, aiming for Jack's head. Jack ducked, his movements precise and controlled. He stepped inside the man's reach, using his momentum against him. With a quick twist, Jack sent him stumbling backward, crashing into one of the gas pumps. Another biker came at him from the side, a chain swinging from his hand. Jack caught the chain mid-swing, yanking it out of the man's grasp before delivering a sharp kick to his midsection. The leader watched, his smirk now replaced by a scowl. He hadn't expected this, hadn't expected the quiet old man to be anything more than a target for their amusement. Get him, he shouted, his voice tinged with frustration. The remaining bikers hesitated, their confidence shaken. They glanced at each other, uncertainty flashing across their faces. Jack straightened up, his breathing steady, his eyes locked on the leader. You can walk away, he said, his voice calm but unyielding. It's not too late. The leader's face twisted with anger, his pride refusing to let him back down. He reached into his jacket, pulling out a knife with a gleaming blade. Not a chance, he growled. Inside the gas station, the young attendant's breath caught in his throat. He ducked lower behind the counter, his hands shaking as he fumbled for his phone. Jack's gaze flickered to the knife, then back to the leader's face. He didn't move, didn't react, except to shift his stance ever so slightly. Don't do it, Jack said quietly. The leader took a step forward, the knife glinting in the sunlight. "What are you gonna do, old man?" "Stop me." Jack didn't answer. He didn't need to. The look in his eyes was enough. The leader lunged, the blade slicing through the air. But Jack was faster. He sidestepped the attack with a fluid motion, his hand coming up to catch the leader's wrist. With a sharp twist, he disarmed him, the knife clattering to the ground. Before the leader could react, Jack grabbed him by the collar and spun him around, pinning him against the truck. The other bikers froze, their bravado evaporating as they watched their leader struggle in Jack's grip. "You don't want to do this," Jack said, his voice low and steady. "Walk away while you still can." The leader's chest heaved, his pride warring with the realization that he was outmatched. For a moment, it seemed like he might fight back. But then his shoulders slumped, and he gave a reluctant nod. Jack released him, stepping back but keeping his eyes on the group. The leader stumbled, rubbing his wrist as he glared at Jack. "This isn't over," he spat, his voice filled with venom. Jack didn't respond. He simply stood there, his presence alone enough to hold the group in check. The bikers exchanged uneasy glances before slowly retreating to their bikes. One by one, they started their engines, the growls of their machines filling the air once more. The leader was the last to mount his bike, his eyes never leaving Jack. "You're gonna regret this," he said, pointing a finger at him. Jack's expression didn't change. "Maybe. But not today." The leader revved his engine, his frustration evident in the aggressive roar. Then, with a cloud of dust and gravel, the bikers sped off, disappearing down the road. The gas station lot fell silent, the tension dissipating like a storm that had passed. Jack turned back to his truck, picking up his thermos and examining it briefly. Inside the gas station, the young attendant finally exhaled, his body sagging with relief. Jack glanced toward the convenience store, giving the boy a small nod before climbing into his truck. As the engine rumbled to life, Jack looked out at the empty road ahead. He didn't say a word. He didn't need to. The quiet had returned. The leader's confident grin faltered, just for a second, before he quickly masked it with a sneer. "Big talk for someone standing all alone," he shot back, but his voice lacked the same punch. Jack shrugged, leaning casually against his truck as if the gang of men surrounding him were nothing more than a mild inconvenience. "You're not as unpredictable as you think," he said, his voice calm. "You come into places like this, stir up trouble, make a show of being tough. Seen it 100 times. The wiry biker with the scar stepped forward, cracking his knuckles. "And how'd it end, huh? With guys like you running for cover?" Jack tilted his head, the faintest glimmer of amusement in his eyes. "No," he said simply. "It usually ends with someone like me teaching someone like you a hard lesson." The gas station attendant, still cowering behind the counter inside, peeked out just enough to catch Jack's steady, unbothered demeanor. He couldn't understand it how this man, so calm and unarmed, could hold his ground against these rough, intimidating bikers. The leader stepped closer, his broad shoulders blocking the sun for a moment. His shadow fell across Jack, but Jack didn't move. "You've got guts, old man," the leader growled. "But guts only get you so far. I think you're bluffing. I don't see a gun. Don't see a badge. You're just some washed-up nobody, hoping we'll back down because you talk a good game." Jack let the silence linger, his eyes scanning the group. "You're right," he said finally. "No gun. No badge. But I've got something you don't." The bikers exchanged confused glances. "Oh yeah? What's that?" one of them scoffed. Jack straightened up, his posture shifting ever so slightly. His voice lowered, each word carrying weight. "Experience." The leader barked out a laugh, though it sounded more forced than confident. Experience. What, you mean fixing trucks and counting retirement checks? Jack's expression didn't change, but his eyes sharpened. No, he said. I mean knowing how to size up a situation. Knowing who's dangerous and who's just pretending. The leader stiffened, his bravado slipping further. You calling me a pretender? Jack didn't answer right away. Instead, he took a step closer, his voice dropping to a near whisper. You tell me, he said. Because right now, you're making all the moves of a man trying to convince himself he's still in charge. The group fell silent, the tension thickening. The stocky biker with the cigarette shifted uncomfortably, glancing at his leader as if waiting for a cue. The leader's jaw tightened, his pride visibly warring with the seed of doubt Jack had planted. All right, he said, his voice louder than necessary. Enough with the games. You want to act tough? Let's see how tough you really are. He reached out, grabbing Jack by the front of his shirt. The move was sudden, meant to catch Jack off guard. But Jack didn't flinch. In one fluid motion, Jack grabbed the leader's wrist, twisting it sharply. The biker yelped in pain, stumbling back as Jack released him. The rest of the gang froze, their eyes darting between their leader and Jack. For the first time, uncertainty flickered across their faces. The wiry man with the scar stepped forward, his fists clenched. You think that's gonna scare us? He spat. There's 5 of us and 1 of you. Jack turned to him, his expression unreadable. Then I guess the odds are in your favor, he said. If you're sure about that, go ahead. Take your shot. The scarred man hesitated, his bravado faltering. The way Jack stood, calm and unyielding, made it hard to read him. It was as if Jack wasn't worried about the outcome, like he'd already calculated every possible move and knew exactly how it would play out. The leader rubbed his wrist, glaring at Jack. You're making a mistake, old man, he snarled. We don't walk away from things like this. Jack shrugged again, his voice steady. That's your choice. But if you push this any further, it won't end the way you think. The stocky biker muttered under his breath, his gaze flicking nervously to the gas station. Cops might show up, he said, just loud enough for the others to hear. The leader snapped his head toward him. Cops, he scoffed. Like they'd get here in time to do anything. This guy's nobody, just a retired loser trying to feel important. Jack's smirk returned, faint but deliberate. If that's what you think, then go ahead. Prove it. The challenge hung in the air, heavy and unspoken. Inside the station, the attendant fumbled with his phone, debating whether to call for help. But something about the way Jack carried himself made him hesitate. It wasn't just confidence, it was control. Jack wasn't just holding his ground, he was managing the situation, steering it toward an outcome only he could see. The leader took a step back, his eyes narrowing. You're playing a dangerous game, old man. Jack nodded slightly. Maybe. But it's a game I've played before. The leader opened his mouth to retort, but the words didn't come. His crew was restless now, their earlier bravado replaced by unease. They weren't used to this, weren't used to being challenged, especially not by someone who seemed to see through their every move. The scarred man finally broke the silence, his voice edged with frustration. We're wasting time here. Let's just take what we want and go. The leader hesitated, his pride clearly at war with his instincts. But before he could respond, Jack spoke again. Walk away, he said, his tone quiet but firm. Nobody gets hurt. You go your way, I go mine. The leader stared at him, the weight of the decision pressing down like a physical force. His hand twitched at his side, as if debating whether to reach for his knife. But Jack didn't move. His calm, steady presence filled the space, leaving no room for uncertainty. Finally, the leader growled under his breath, shoving his hands into his pockets. "Let's go," he snapped, turning toward his bike. The rest of the gang hesitated, their eyes darting between Jack and their leader. But one by one, they followed, their engines roaring to life as they mounted their bikes. The leader cast one last glare at Jack, his eyes promising retribution. "You got lucky today," he said. "But this ain't over." Jack watched them go, his expression unreadable. Only when the last bike disappeared down the road did he let out a slow breath, the tension leaving his shoulders. Inside the gas station, the attendant finally stood up, his legs trembling. He stared at Jack through the glass, a mixture of awe and disbelief on his face. Jack glanced toward him, offering a small nod before climbing into his truck. As the engine rumbled to life, Jack pulled out onto the empty road, the horizon stretching endlessly ahead. The echoes of the encounter lingered, but Jack's mind was already somewhere else. Because while the bikers had left, Jack knew this wasn't the end. Not by a long shot. Jack drove down the road, his mind replaying the encounter at the gas station. His grip on the steering wheel tightened slightly, not out of fear but calculation. He had spent years in situations like this reading people, analyzing their movements, predicting their next steps. The bikers were trouble, no doubt about it. But Jack knew something else, they weren't finished. He glanced in the rearview mirror. The horizon was empty, the dusty road behind him stretching into nothingness. Still, he couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't over. People like that didn't just let things go. Jack sighed, his face calm but his eyes sharp. "If they're coming, let them," he muttered to himself. His voice carried the weight of a man who had seen too much to be rattled by the likes of them. Miles down the road, the bikers had stopped at a secluded clearing off the highway. Their leader, still nursing his wrist, paced angrily while the rest of the gang leaned against their bikes, waiting for him to speak. "That old man made a fool out of us," the leader growled. "I'm not letting this slide." The wiry biker with the scar spat on the ground, his frustration palpable. "He's not just some random guy," he said, his voice low. "Did you see the way he moved? That wasn't luck. He knew exactly what he was doing." The leader stopped pacing, his eyes narrowing. "You scared of him, Scar?" The scarred biker shook his head but didn't meet his gaze. "I'm just saying we shouldn't underestimate him. Guys like that, they've seen things. Done things." The stocky biker lit another cigarette, exhaling a cloud of smoke. "So what? There's 5 of us. He's just one guy. No way he can take us all." The leader's smirk returned, though it lacked its usual confidence. "Exactly. He's one guy. We'll find him, teach him a lesson he won't forget." "What about the gas station?" the stocky biker asked. "Kid might have called the cops by now." The leader waved him off. "By the time they figure anything out, we'll be long gone. This isn't about the cops. It's about sending a message. Nobody makes a fool of us." The others nodded reluctantly, their loyalty outweighing their lingering doubts. Jack's truck rumbled to a stop outside his small cabin, nestled in a quiet stretch of woods. The place was unassuming, much like Jack himself, a simple structure with a tin roof, a stack of firewood neatly arranged by the porch, and a wind chime swaying gently in the breeze. He stepped out of the truck, pausing for a moment to scan the surroundings. The woods were silent, save for the distant chirping of birds. To most, it would seem like a peaceful haven. To Jack, it was a perimeter. He unlocked the door and stepped inside, setting his thermos on the counter. The cabin's interior was sparse but efficient, every item serving a purpose. A small table with 2 chairs, a worn leather couch, and a shelf lined with books and tools. Jack moved to the back of the cabin, where a heavy trunk sat tucked away in the corner. He knelt down, his fingers brushing over the old metal. For a moment, he hesitated, as if opening it would unearth memories he'd rather leave buried. but he knew better than to ignore his instincts. With a creak, the trunk opened, revealing a collection of items that told a story of a lifelong past: a neatly folded uniform, a pair of sturdy boots, and a weathered handgun resting in its holster. Jack picked up the gun, checking it with practiced precision. He didn't like to carry it anymore, hadn't in years. But today, something felt different. He could sense it, like a storm brewing just beyond the horizon. Back on the highway, the bikers roared down the road, their engines echoing through the otherwise silent landscape. They had split up, 2 of them heading back to scout the gas station while the rest followed the faint trail Jack's truck had left in the dirt. The leader led the way, his eyes scanning the horizon. He wasn't just angry, he was curious. Who was this man who had stood up to them so effortlessly? He had seen something in Jack's eyes, something that didn't belong to an ordinary civilian. As they rode, the wiry biker pulled up alongside him. "You sure about this?" he asked. "What if he's not alone? What if he's expecting us?" The leader sneered. "Then we give him what he's asking for. No one's invincible." Back at the cabin, Jack was preparing. He moved through the space with purpose, every action deliberate. He secured the windows, set a kettle on the stove, and laid out a few supplies on the table. It wasn't panic that drove him, but preparedness. Years of experience had taught him that when trouble came knocking, it was better to meet it head-on than wait for it to kick down the door. He stepped outside, the cool evening air brushing against his face. The sun was dipping below the trees, casting long shadows across the ground. Jack's eyes scanned the tree line, his senses alert. He didn't have to wait long. In the distance, the faint hum of engines reached his ears. It was subtle at first, barely distinguishable from the rustling leaves. But Jack knew better. They were coming. The bikers pulled up to the edge of the woods, cutting their engines as they dismounted. The leader raised a hand, signaling for the others to stay quiet. "He's here," he said, his voice low. "Spread out. Don't let him slip away." The group fanned out, their footsteps crunching softly against the dirt. The leader moved cautiously, his eyes scanning the shadows. The scarred biker stayed close, his unease growing with each step. As they approached the cabin, the leader gestured for 2 of the bikers to circle around the back. He and the scarred biker moved toward the front, their hands hovering near the weapons at their sides. The cabin stood silent and still, its dark windows giving nothing away. Inside, Jack stood by the table, his gun resting in his hand. He could hear them now, footsteps crunching, low murmurs as they approached. He took a deep breath, his grip steady. This wasn't his first time facing danger, and it wouldn't be the last. "Let's see how this plays out," he muttered to himself, his eyes focused on the door. The leader reached the porch, his boots creaking against the wood. He glanced back at the scarred biker, nodding toward the door. "Go on," he whispered. The scarred biker hesitated but stepped forward, his hand reaching for the doorknob. Before he could touch it, Jack's voice rang out, calm and firm. "I wouldn't do that if I were you." The bikers froze, their heads snapping toward the sound. Jack stepped out from the shadows of the porch, his gun held low but ready. His expression was unreadable, his eyes locked on the leader. "This is your last chance," he said, his voice steady. "Walk away. Now." For a moment, the woods were silent, the tension thick enough to cut with a knife. The leader clenched his jaw, his pride refusing to back down. And then, the storm broke. The leader hesitated, his bravado faltering as the weight of Jack's presence began to settle over the group. The badge wasn't just a piece of metal, it was a statement. It told a story of a man who had lived through chaos, faced down threats, and come out the other side sharper and more dangerous than they could imagine. But the leader wasn't ready to back down, not yet. His pride burned brighter than his common sense. "A badge doesn't mean anything now," he sneered. "You're retired." Out of the game. Just an old man trying to relive his glory days. Jack tilted his head slightly, his expression calm but calculating. "You're right," he said, his tone conversational. "I'm retired. But that doesn't mean I've forgotten how to handle people like you." The leader clenched his fists, motioning for his gang to spread out. "Let's see how tough you really are." The air grew thick with tension as the bikers moved to surround Jack. The leader gestured toward the scarred biker, who hesitated but stepped forward, pulling out a chain wrapped around his fist. Another biker brandished a length of pipe, while the stocky one cracked his knuckles menacingly. Jack, still calm, took a step back to position himself strategically. "You think numbers are your advantage," he said, his voice cutting through the tense silence. "That just means more of you are going to regret this." The leader barked a laugh. "Big talk for one guy against 5. Jack didn't respond. Instead, he shifted his weight slightly, his stance now unmistakably that of someone ready for combat. His eyes darted between the men, already calculating angles, distances, and weaknesses. The scarred biker lunged first, swinging the chain in a wide arc. Jack sidestepped effortlessly, grabbing the chain mid-swing and yanking it hard. The biker stumbled forward, losing his balance, and Jack delivered a swift elbow to his ribs, sending him to the ground gasping for air. The biker with the pipe rushed in next, aiming for Jack's midsection. Jack ducked under the swing, his movements fluid and precise. He grabbed the man's wrist, twisting it sharply until the pipe clattered to the ground. A quick shove sent the biker crashing into a nearby pile of crates. The remaining 3 hesitated, their confidence shaken. Jack straightened up, his eyes locking onto the leader. "Still think this is a good idea?" The leader's jaw tightened. "Don't just stand there," he shouted at his crew. "Get him." The stocky biker charged, his bulk making him slower but more dangerous if he managed to land a hit. Jack waited until the last possible second before stepping aside, using the man's momentum against him. A well-placed shove sent the biker sprawling into the dirt. Now it was just the leader and one other. The wiry biker, who had been hanging back, finally stepped forward, pulling out a knife with a trembling hand. Jack's sharp eyes caught the movement immediately. "You don't want to do this," Jack said, his voice calm but firm. "Put it down." The wiry biker hesitated, his grip on the knife faltering. He looked at Jack, then at his leader, caught between fear and loyalty. "Don't be a coward," the leader snapped. "Do it." But the wiry biker shook his head, dropping the knife to the ground. "I'm out," he muttered, stepping back. "This isn't worth it." The leader cursed under his breath, his anger now mixed with a growing sense of unease. He was alone, and he knew it. Jack took a step closer, his gaze unwavering. "It's over," he said. "Walk away before you make things worse for yourself." But the leader's pride wouldn't let him back down. With a roar, he lunged at Jack, swinging wildly. Jack dodged the blows with ease, his movements efficient and controlled. When the opening came, he struck 1, 2, 3 quick hits that left the leader staggering and gasping for breath. The fight ended as quickly as it began. The leader dropped to his knees, defeated, his bravado shattered. Jack stood over him, his breathing steady, his expression calm but resolute. "This is your last chance," he said, his voice low. "Leave now. And don't come back." The remaining bikers scrambled to gather their fallen comrades, dragging them to their bikes. The wiry biker avoided Jack's gaze as he helped the scarred one to his feet. The stocky biker muttered curses under his breath but made no move to continue the fight. The leader, still on his knees, glared up at Jack. "You think this is over?" he spat. "You can't scare me forever." Jack leaned down slightly, his eyes locking onto the leader's. "It's not about fear," he said. "It's about respect. Learn it, or the next time we meet, you won't walk away." The leader's glare faltered, and he lowered his gaze. Without another word, he climbed onto his bike, his gang following suit. The roar of their engines faded into the distance, leaving Jack alone in the quiet clearing. Jack watched them go, his posture finally relaxing. He holstered his weapon and let out a slow breath, his mind already shifting gears. He wasn't a man who enjoyed violence, but he understood its necessity in moments like this. He turned and walked back toward the gas station, where the teenager was still hiding behind the counter. Jack tapped on the glass to get his attention. "You're safe now," Jack said, his tone gentle. "They won't be back." The teenager emerged slowly, his face a mix of awe and relief. Who are you?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Jack paused for a moment, then smiled faintly. "Just someone who knows how to handle trouble," he said. And with that, he climbed back into his truck and drove off, the dust from his tires swirling in the air as the horizon swallowed him once more. The sound of the bikers' engines faded into the distance, but Jack knew better than to assume this was truly over. Men like the gang's leader didn't just let things go. They nursed grudges like wounds, letting them fester until they erupted into something worse. Jack had seen it too many times in his past life, people blinded by pride, incapable of recognizing when they'd been outmatched. He parked his truck at a small ridge overlooking the highway, the early evening sun casting long shadows across the land. Jack reached for his thermos, taking a sip of now lukewarm coffee, his mind replaying the fight in vivid detail. He had been measured and efficient, but it wasn't just his skill that had unsettled the gang, it was his presence. He had learned long ago that confidence, when wielded correctly, could be as powerful as any weapon. Meanwhile, the bikers regrouped several miles down the road, pulling off into a makeshift camp hidden by a grove of trees. The leader, his face still red from the humiliation, stormed around the clearing, kicking at rocks and muttering curses under his breath. "This isn't over," he growled, slamming his fist against a nearby tree. "That old man made fools of us." The wiry biker, now sitting on a fallen log, wiped the blood from his nose with the back of his hand. "Maybe we should just let it go," he said hesitantly. "He's not like anyone we've dealt with before." The leader whipped around, his eyes blazing. "Let it go? You saw what he did, didn't you? That guy humiliated us. I'm not walking away from that." "But he could have finished us if he wanted to," the wiry biker argued, his voice steady despite his nerves. "He didn't. That tells me he's not looking for a fight. That tells me he thinks he's better than us," the leader snapped. "And I'm going to prove him wrong." The scarred biker, still nursing his bruised ribs, spoke up from where he leaned against his motorcycle. "He's dangerous, man. This isn't just about teaching someone a lesson. If we go after him, we better be ready for what's coming." The leader's jaw clenched as he stared down his men, his pride refusing to accept their hesitation. "Then we'll be ready," he said through gritted teeth. "No one does that to me and gets away with it." Jack's instincts told him the bikers wouldn't leave things alone. The way the leader had looked at him, it wasn't just anger. It was humiliation. Men like that didn't let humiliation slide. They'd come back, maybe with more men or weapons, thinking they could tip the scales in their favor. Jack leaned against the hood of his truck, scanning the horizon. The sun dipped lower, painting the sky in shades of orange and red. He reached into the glove box and pulled out a small, unassuming notebook. Flipping it open, he scanned through pages filled with handwritten notes and sketches, each one a piece of his carefully crafted contingency plans. His finger traced a map he had drawn of the surrounding area, noting choke points and vantage spots. Years of service had taught him the value of preparation. Trouble might find him, but Jack never met trouble unprepared. As night fell, Jack returned to his cabin. The soft glow of the porch light illuminated the simple structure, its modest appearance belying the layers of security Jack had put in place. He locked the door behind him, his eyes instinctively scanning the room for anything out of place. The cabin wasn't just a home, it was a fortress in disguise. Jack had spent years fine-tuning it, ensuring that it could withstand more than just the elements. Hidden cameras covered the perimeter, their feeds accessible from a discreet monitor in the corner. The walls, while appearing rustic, were reinforced with steel plating. And tucked away in the back room was an arsenal that most small-town police stations would envy. Jack moved to the monitor, cycling through the camera feeds. The woods around his property were quiet for now, but he knew that could change at any moment. He leaned back in his chair, the faint hum of the equipment filling the silence. "They'll come," he said to himself, his voice low but certain. "And when they do, they'll wish they hadn't." Back at the bikers' camp, the leader was formulating his plan. He had called in reinforcements, 2 more men from a neighboring town, both of them just as rough and reckless as the rest of the gang. They arrived on their motorcycles, the roar of their engines cutting through the night air. "You called for backup," one of them said as he dismounted, his leather jacket gleaming in the firelight. The leader nodded. "We've got a score to settle." The new arrivals exchanged glances, clearly intrigued. "Who's the target?" the second man asked. The leader's expression darkened. "An old man who thinks he's untouchable." The first man laughed, a deep, guttural sound. "Sounds like easy pickings." The scarred biker shook his head. "He's not just some old man. He's trained. Military, maybe. Law enforcement for sure. He took us apart like it was nothing." The laughter stopped, and the newcomers' expressions turned serious. "You didn't mention that," one of them said. The leader's fists tightened. "It doesn't matter who he is. We've got the numbers now. We'll take him down." The hours ticked by as the gang prepared, checking their weapons and going over their plan. They'd approach under the cover of darkness, surrounding Jack's cabin before making their move. They believed that numbers and surprise would be enough to tip the scales in their favor. What they didn't know was that Jack was already waiting for them. As the bikers made their way through the woods, the night was eerily quiet. The leader motioned for them to kill their engines a few hundred yards from the cabin, relying on stealth for the final approach. Jack, watching from his monitor, saw them before they even crossed the tree line. He leaned forward, his eyes narrowing as he counted their numbers. 7. They had brought reinforcements. "Predictable," he muttered. Jack stood, moving with purpose to the back room. He grabbed a compact rifle, a set of night vision goggles, and a small device resembling a remote control. This wasn't his first encounter with men who underestimated him, and he doubted it would be his last. The bikers crept closer, their footsteps muffled by the soft forest floor. They spread out as they approached the cabin, each man taking a position around the perimeter. The leader held up a hand, signaling for silence as they moved into place. Inside the cabin, Jack waited, his rifle resting against his shoulder. He activated the remote control, triggering a series of floodlights hidden around the property. The sudden burst of light illuminated the clearing, exposing the bikers in their tracks. The element of surprise was gone, replaced by a tension that hung heavy in the air. Jack stepped onto the porch, his silhouette framed by the bright lights. "You boys sure picked the wrong house," he called out, his voice carrying a calm authority. The leader gritted his teeth, raising his weapon. "Get him," he shouted. And then, chaos erupted. "Would you like me to continue?" The roar of the motorcycles faded into the distance, the dust settling in their wake. The once tense air, thick with hostility, now felt oddly empty, like a storm had passed and left nothing but silence in its place. Jack stood still for a moment, watching as the last of the bikers disappeared down the road. His eyes narrowed, not in anger, but in quiet satisfaction. He hadn't been looking for a fight, but he'd known it was coming. And when it did, he'd handled it the only way he knew how, swiftly, decisively, and without mercy. The teenager who had been hiding behind the counter now stepped out into the open, his face a mix of awe and disbelief. He was a kid, probably no older than 18, his hands still shaking from the adrenaline of what had just happened. He stared at Jack for a long moment, as if trying to understand how one man, with nothing more than a few words and a commanding presence, had sent a gang of bikers running. Jack wiped his hands on his jeans, taking a deep breath. "You all right?" he asked, his voice softer now. The teenager nodded slowly, still trying to process everything. I didn't know what to do," he admitted, his voice shaking slightly. I thought we were done for when they pulled up." Jack chuckled quietly, his eyes twinkling behind the rim of his hat. "You're not the only one who thought that," he said with a grin. "But it never hurts to stay calm and wait for the right moment." The teenager seemed to snap back to reality, his eyes scanning the lot for any sign of danger. Do you know them? The bikers?" Jack shook his head, his expression thoughtful. "Nope. Never seen them before today. But people like that tend to make a lot of noise wherever they go. They think it makes them tough." The kid let out a nervous laugh, his shoulders relaxing as he took in the calm, unruffled demeanor of the man standing in front of him. "I don't know how you did it, man," he said, his voice filled with admiration. "But that was something else." Jack shrugged, not one to bask in the praise. "Just a little experience," he said, his eyes scanning the horizon for any signs of the gang's return. He had a feeling they wouldn't be back anytime soon, but it never hurt to stay alert. For a long moment, the teenager just stood there, his eyes locked on Jack as if waiting for him to say more. But Jack didn't offer anything else. He had made his point, and the rest was up to the kid. Finally, the teenager spoke again, his voice quiet but sincere. "Thanks for saving us. I don't know what would have happened if you hadn't been here." Jack gave a small nod, tipping his hat once more. "Don't mention it. Just doing what I used to do," he said, his voice distant as he turned to look out over the empty lot. "But it's time for me to get going. I've done my part." The teenager watched him for a moment, as if trying to understand the man who had just walked into his life like a force of nature, only to disappear as quickly as he had arrived. "Wait," he called out before Jack could turn away. "I don't even know your name." Jack stopped in his tracks and turned back to face the kid. There was a pause, just a moment of stillness before he finally spoke. "Jack," he said simply. "Jack Mercer." The teenager nodded slowly, taking the name in. "Jack Mercer," he repeated. "I won't forget it. You really saved my skin today." Jack smiled faintly, the kind of smile that spoke volumes without saying a word. "You'll be fine. Just remember, trouble doesn't always look like what you expect. Sometimes it's quieter, more dangerous than you think." The teenager nodded again, a newfound sense of respect in his eyes. "I will. Thanks again, Jack." With that, Jack turned away and headed for his truck. The gravel crunched beneath his boots as he made his way back to the vehicle, his movements deliberate and steady. He didn't look back at the gas station, but he knew the teenager would be fine. The kid had seen what kind of man Jack was, and now, he had the chance to carry that lesson forward. Jack climbed into his truck, the door creaking slightly as it shut behind him. He adjusted his hat, glanced at the rearview mirror, and then, without another word, drove off into the distance. Back at the gas station, the teenager watched as Jack's truck disappeared down the road, the tail lights fading into the horizon. His heart still raced from the adrenaline, but it was beginning to slow now, the shock of the encounter starting to wear off. He had never expected a day like this. A day when his whole world would flip upside down and then right itself again, all in the span of a few minutes. He took a deep breath, glancing around the empty lot. The wind rustled the trees, and the sound of the distant highway was the only noise now. The danger had passed, but something else lingered in the air, a sense of something bigger, something deeper, just beneath the surface. The kind of feeling you get when you realize the world is far more complicated than you ever thought. But it wasn't just the world that was complicated. It was people, too. The teenager knew that, now. He'd seen it with his own eyes. The bikers, arrogant and threatening, were just part of the picture. But Jack Mercer, he was something else entirely. He was the kind of man who didn't need to prove anything. He didn't rely on force or intimidation. He simply handled things with quiet confidence, and that, the teenager realized, was something he could learn from. With a sigh, the teenager turned back to the counter, wiping down the surface where the bikers had left their mess. He had a job to do, and now he had a new sense of purpose to carry with him. He wasn't going to forget today. Not ever. As the sun dipped below the horizon, the world seemed to settle into a peaceful quiet. The gas station, once a place of tension and fear, now felt like a calm, ordinary spot again. The night stretched out ahead, full of possibilities, and the teenager knew that no matter what came next, he had seen something that would stay with him forever. Jack Mercer wasn't just a man who saved the day. He was a reminder that sometimes, doing the right thing wasn't about making a spectacle of yourself. It was about knowing when to act, when to speak, and when to let your actions do the talking. The teenager smiled to himself, a quiet sense of pride filling him. Jack Mercer had shown him more than just how to stand up to danger. He had shown him how to stand up for what mattered. And that, he thought, was something worth remembering. The sound of the truck's engine hummed softly in the stillness as Jack's vehicle rumbled away from the gas station. The dust settled around the small lot, and the sun, now sinking lower on the horizon, cast long shadows across the empty space. For a brief moment, everything seemed to slow down, as if time itself had taken a breath, allowing the world to catch up with what had just happened. Jack didn't look back, but there was no need to. He'd made his point, and the moment had passed. What mattered now was the quiet. The silence that followed was a strange one, peaceful, yet charged with something unspoken. He'd seen it all before. The arrogance of people who believed that power came from how loud you could be, how intimidating you could act. People like the bikers who had rolled up to the station that day. They thought strength came from fear, from the chaos they stirred. But Jack knew better. The real power wasn't in shouting or threatening or trying to break others down. The real power came from knowing who you were, from standing firm in the face of challenge, and from handling situations with calm confidence. It wasn't about trying to prove you could fight. It was about proving you didn't need to. As Jack drove down the dusty road, the landscape unfolding in front of him, he thought back to the teenager behind the counter. The kid had looked up to him, but Jack knew the truth. He wasn't some superhero. He was just a man who had been through a lot and learned a thing or two along the way. The teenager would get there too, in time. He would understand that sometimes, you didn't need to shout or fight back. Sometimes, the best thing you could do was just stand your ground and let your actions speak for themselves. The road ahead stretched on, empty and quiet, as if waiting for whatever came next. But Jack wasn't in a hurry. He didn't need to rush. His life had been full of moments like this, where things slowed down, where everything seemed to fall into place. He'd earned this peace. And if anything, today's events reminded him of just how much he appreciated it. Jack had spent years in a world of noise and chaos. Years in law enforcement, facing dangerous situations, dealing with people who thought they could get away with anything because they were loud, because they were fearless in their own twisted way. But Jack knew that real strength wasn't measured by how much noise you made. It was about the quiet moments, the moments when you made a difference without anyone even realizing it. His thoughts drifted to the gang of bikers. They had been cocky, arrogant, thinking they could just roll up and do whatever they wanted. They were used to bullying their way through life, assuming their size, their bikes, and their bad attitudes would give them power. But what they didn't know, what they never understood, was that Jack wasn't intimidated by their bravado. He had faced real danger, real enemies, and come out the other side stronger each time. The bikers might have thought they were tough, but Jack knew the truth: strength wasn't about physical size. It was about control, about confidence, and about knowing exactly when to take action and when to hold back. And that was exactly what he had done today. Jack hadn't needed to shout, hadn't needed to swing a punch or fire a shot. He had simply let the bikers show who they were. He let them make their own mistakes, and when the time was right, he acted. There was a certain power in that, a quiet, unspoken authority that couldn't be ignored. And that was the lesson Jack hoped the teenager behind the counter would take with him. The kid would probably never see Jack again. He would go on with his life, back to his ordinary day-to-day routine, but something would be different now. He would have a story, sure, but more than that, he would have learned something about strength. About how power didn't need to be loud to be real. About how sometimes, the toughest people were the ones who didn't have to prove it. As Jack's truck rumbled along the road, he glanced in the rearview mirror. The gas station was now far behind him, a small dot in the distance. It was just another stop on a long journey, another day in the books. But today had felt different. Maybe it was the kid's face, full of admiration, or maybe it was the gang of bikers, who had thought they were the toughest guys around, only to be shown up by a man who hadn't raised his voice. He smiled to himself. It wasn't about winning. It wasn't even about proving anything. It was about being who you were, knowing your worth, and handling the world as it came at you quietly, confidently, and without needing to make a scene. The sun dipped lower, and the shadows stretched longer, the world settling into evening. The road ahead was wide and open, full of possibilities. Jack wasn't chasing anything. He didn't need to. He had learned long ago that the best way to find peace wasn't by running from trouble, it was by standing firm and facing whatever came your way. And that was the lesson Jack had learned after all these years. Sometimes, it wasn't about fighting back. Sometimes, it was about knowing that you didn't need to fight at all. That was the strength that mattered. Jack leaned back in his seat, his hand resting on the wheel. He didn't need to be loud. He didn't need to be a hero. He had done what he came to do, and now, it was time to move on. But the lesson would stay with him, and it would stay with the teenager at the gas station too. The world was full of noise. But the quiet ones, the ones who didn't need to shout, were often the ones who made the most difference. Jack Mercer had shown them that. And as the road stretched out before him, Jack knew that, no matter where life took him next, he would always carry that lesson with him: you don't have to prove anything to anyone. You just have to be yourself. With a final glance at the fading horizon, Jack Mercer drove off into the night, the world ahead of him as calm and vast as the open road.